I've been a pastor for 41 years. And I am tired, not of ministry, I'm tired of half-hearted people who want to call themselves Christians but don't want to act like Christians, who want the blessings of God, the benefits that come from being a Christian, but not wanting to do anything to share those benefits and those blessings with other people. And I'm kind of like Ted. I just want to find a few people, a handful of people who are desperate for God, who are tired of things as they are, and who want to make a difference. Now, I'm inviting you to turn to Mark chapter 5 today. In Mark chapter 5, we find the story of Jesus ministering to a couple of different desperate people. Now, I could focus on divine healing because Jesus does do that in this passage. But this passage is as much about ministry as it is about anything else. I'm going to read a few verses. I'm not going to read the whole passage, although we are going to be talking about the whole passage. I want you to, in Mark chapter 5, begin with me as I read, beginning with verse 21. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials, named Jairus, came up and on seeing him, fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay hands on her so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. And a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak, for she thought, "If I just touch his garments, I will get well." Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." I want to share, first of all, from this passage about the circumstances. You need to understand a little bit more about the circumstances than you find in the passage. There's some background. First of all, Jairus. Jairus in this passage has a daughter. Luke, in another gospel, Luke tells us that she is his only daughter. And this daughter is at the point of death. Now, Jairus was a prominent citizen, probably wealthy, and he had probably done all he could to get help for his daughter. But the medical measures had been exhausted. She is fading away, and he desperately searches out for Jesus. He hears about him being in Galilee. He has been at one of the disciples' homes on the seashore. And Jairus finds out where he is, and he comes, falls at Jesus' feet, Now, this was a common practice to honor someone you fell at their feet, but you can see this father, his only daughter is dying, and he is desperate for help. So he falls at Jesus' feet, and the words, he earnestly begs, he pleads with Jesus for the life of his only daughter. Desperate for help. Nowhere else to turn, and now he's turning to Jesus. As he's on his way, Jesus and this crowd following him and his disciples, as he is on his way to minister to Jairus' daughter, there's a woman in the crowd. Notice, Jairus has a name. The woman is not named. She's just a woman with a problem. It says that she's had a hemorrhage for 12 years. Now, if you've had a medical problem for 12 years, you know how difficult and discouraging that can be. After 12 years, you've probably given up hope that there's anything that can be done for you. You say a hemorrhage, a discharge of blood. What in the world is that about? Well, we're not told exactly what was the cause of the problem, but we know that it was a problem that left her constantly anemic, in a weakened state, drained of energy. 12 years she's been this way. In Mark's gospel, we see just how difficult it is in 4 statements. First of all, it says that she had suffered many treatments. Suffered at the hands of many doctors. You know, some people I have talked to who've had an illness like this, an illness that the doctors could not figure out, an illness that the doctors could not pinpoint, put their finger on it, or provide any help. They go from one doctor to another trying to find help, and they just feel like, frankly, like a guinea pig, like they're being poked and prodded. Now, I'm not against the medical profession. It's a very noble profession, and I'm thankful for people in the medical profession who seek to help others. Don't get me wrong, but there's a limit. There's a limit to what can be accomplished. And no doctor was able to provide her help. It says also that she had spent all that she had. Reminds me of when Sheila lost her sight in her left eye. And she went through all kinds of procedures, and we paid all kinds of money to find out there was nothing that could be done for her. You know, after you've spent thousands of dollars of your money plus insurance money on top of that, to find out that there's nothing that can be done, that is pretty discouraging, isn't it? Not only that, it says further that not only had she spent all of her money and gone to all these doctors and tried all these treatments, but rather than getting better, she was actually getting worse. Now again, that's not a condemnation of the medical profession so much as it is an acknowledgement of the limitations of medicine. We live in an age and a generation where people think there ought to be a pill for everything. Take a pill and replace your liver. Take a pill and restore your sight. Take a pill, or there's some medical procedure. There's got to be something that can be done. But even in our advanced age, even in our scientific age, there are limits to what we can do. There are limits to the medical profession. There are limits to our knowledge and understanding of the human body. There are limits, and we need to understand that. But this woman experienced more than a medical problem. You see, She lived in a time when the Old Testament law was followed. And because blood was sacred, anyone who had a discharge of blood was considered unclean. Now, what does it mean to be unclean? Well, it meant that not only did she have a problem that she had to admit, at least she had to say, I'm unclean. If she touched anybody, they would also be unclean. Now, of course, if you were unclean, there was a procedure you could go through to be pronounced clean again. You weren't in a perpetual state of uncleanness, except this woman was, because for 12 years she had been experiencing this hemorrhage. So for 12 years, this was her religious fate. She had to go around everywhere she went. She had to declare that she was unclean, so that anybody who cared would stay away, because they didn't want to get unclean. She was excluded from the synagogue. She was excluded from worshiping at the temple. She was excluded from social gatherings and religious gatherings and festivals. In other words, she might as well have been a leper. Nobody wanted to be around her. Nobody wanted to touch her. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with her. Can you imagine what it must have felt like to walk in a crowd and say, I am unclean, I am unclean, I am unclean? Not only that, she had a social problem. When nobody wants to be around you, you feel what? You feel isolated. You feel lonely. You feel feared. I mean, can you see the fear in people's eyes as they see you coming, knowing that you're unclean? She was poor because she had spent all that she had trying to get well. She was desperate. She was helpless. She was hopeless. And she probably even felt that maybe God didn't even care about her anymore. Can you think of people who might be feeling that in our society? People who feel excluded, stigmatized, uncomfortable. Maybe people who have addictions. People who are HIV positive, who have AIDS. Unwed mothers, homeless people, people who've been incarcerated, who have a criminal record. People with problems who have been dealing with them for so long, unsuccessfully, that they are starting to feel desperate. I want you to realize all of this for one reason. I want you to see just how desperate this woman really was. There's a contrast here. I want you to notice that too. Jairus, the synagogue official, the ruler of the synagogue, was a prominent citizen, as I said, possibly even wealthy. He was one of the ones that managed the affairs and the services of the synagogue. So he was looked to in the community like the board member of a large church would be looked to. He was one who had a reputation. The woman isn't even named. She's poor, ashamed, Jairus comes to Jesus and falls down at his feet. This woman is so ashamed and reluctant that she won't announce herself. She just slips into the crowd so that she can just touch Jesus, not bother him, not get his attention. She just feels like if she can get close enough to him, she'll find an answer to her problem. And then there's the cure. First of all, there's the plea of faith. Jairus offers that. He falls down at Jesus' feet and begs him to heal his daughter. And there's the touch of faith that this woman had, who came to Jesus and she touched, Matthew says, the hem of his garment. Now we'll talk about that in just a second. I want to mention this touch of faith because it's so prominent in the story. The point is made clearly here. Even the disciples, when Jesus says, "Who touched me?" the disciples say, "Duh, everybody's crowding around. Of course there are people touching you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" In fact, in Luke, we find out that the spokesman for the disciples is none other than, can you guess? Which disciple's always outspoken? Peter. Peter's the one who looks at Jesus and says for the other disciples, "What are you talking about? Everybody's touching you." But obviously, and the point is made very clearly in the story, that not all touches are equal. Many were touching Jesus, but only one touch counted. And that was the touch of a woman who was reaching out in faith to Jesus. Now, like all true disciples, or all true Jews who followed the law, Jesus was wearing a shimla. A shimla was a square cloth that was thrown over the shoulders, and at each corner of the cloth there was a tassel attached by a blue cord. And if you go back to Numbers chapter 15, you find that the reason for that was God told them to wear this as a reminder that they were to obey the Lord and His commandments. The part of the cloth, the part of the garment that the woman touched, was one of those tassels hanging from that cloak that was wrapped around Jesus' shoulders. The only thing she could reach, the tassel, and she touched it. Now here's something else interesting about the touch of faith. This woman, by touching Jesus, was doing what? She was risking making him unclean. But here's the beauty of this story. When she touches Jesus, rather than him being unclean, he makes her clean. Isn't that great? That's the wonderful beauty of Jesus and his ministry. He turns things around. What is unlovely, he makes lovely. What is unclean, he makes clean. What is hurting, he heals, he restores. The irony, and by the way, Jesus calls this woman out, doesn't he? Now, do you think that Jesus was wondering who touched him? That's kind of what it sounds like, but we know that that's not Jesus. Jesus didn't ask who touched me because he didn't know. He asked who touched me because he wanted this woman to come forth. And even in her coming forth, we see how ashamed, how reluctant she is. But she comes forth. She spills her guts before the Lord. She tells the whole truth, the Bible says here. And Jesus says to her, "Your faith has made you whole. While he's talking and dealing with this woman, what happens next? Well, if you read this story, you find that people from Jairus' home come and they tell him, no use to bother Jesus now. Your daughter is dead. And Jesus hears that. And he says, no, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. Now get this. Is she really dead? Yes. She really is dead. Yeah. But to the resurrection and the life, death is only sleep. All through the New Testament, you find when Christians have died, what does it say? They've fallen asleep. Why? Because death is not the end. For the Christian, it never is. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, though they die, they shall live. And those who live and believe in me shall never die. Jesus gets to Jairus' house, calls 3 of his disciples in with him and the father and mother of the daughter, and raises her from the dead. Only in this case, he does not tell them to go spread the news, does he? He tells them to keep it quiet. And there's a reason for that. Some people just don't know how to tell it. Jesus did not want to raise suspicion, superstition about his ministry. He was meeting the needs of people. Now, here's what I want you to hear. You got the story. You got the facts. Here's what I want you to hear. Here's what I want. I want to grab a handful of people, or maybe 2 handfuls, I don't care, or 3. I think our motto here should be every member a minister. When you've got a sea of need all around you, you need a sea of ministers to help reach out and meet the needs. But ministry that I'm talking about requires training, which we'll provide. But I don't want you to be misunderstanding about this. Ministry, first of all, is inconvenient. Jesus is teaching and preaching when Jairus comes to him with a need. So what does he do? He heads off to Jairus' house, but while he's going to Jairus' house, what happens? A woman who has a need reaches out to him. This is the ministry of Jesus. It's constantly changing. It's constantly in flux because there are so many people with need reaching out to him. I've often said in jest, I wish people would schedule their problems at convenient times. Why do people have to have problems between 1 and 5 in the morning? Why can't they do it at a decent hour? At least give us a 9 to 5 schedule, you know? But when do people usually have problems? At all hours of the day and night. And if you want to minister for Jesus, you're going to have to get accustomed to not being in control, to being inconvenienced. Because if you don't have time for people in need, you're not going to be able to help them. The second thing I'll say about ministry is it's messy. You don't get to choose the kind of problems people have. You don't get to say, well, I'll deal with this, but I won't even come close to that. The third thing I want to say about ministry is it's difficult. What do I mean by that? Excuse me, this is what I mean by that. You encounter people when they are desperate. And when they're desperate, they're not always kind. They're liable to say things that you'll misunderstand. You get people on the edge, okay? You need to learn to deal with that. You can't afford to let edgy people make you edgy. You can't. It's time consuming. I had a pastor tell me one time early in my ministry that a lot of my ministry would be through interruptions. Because that's when ministry takes place. When you plan out your day and you're going this way, and all of a sudden what happens? Someone interrupts your plans because they have a need. That's ministry. If you don't make time for ministry, then don't plan on having a ministry. If you've read the Gospel of Mark, you notice there's one word that keeps sticking out over and over again. It's immediately or straightway, depending on your translation. Immediately, Jesus does this. Immediately, this happens. Now, it's not as though Jesus is living in the fast lane. But that word immediately tells us Jesus is on a mission, and his life, though it may seem out of control, his life is in the hands of God. And one thing after another comes. Immediately this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. That's ministry. Excuse me. Don't you just love Tennessee weather this time of year? Ministry is draining. Did you hear me? If you're not careful, it can suck the life out of you. Now, it says in this passage that power went out from Jesus to heal this woman. He chose to heal her because he felt her touch of faith, recognized it, and rewarded it. And it doesn't seem like he lacks energy here, but I tell you, if you read the life of Jesus in the Gospels, you find often, because he was a man as well as God, he had to take periods of recess. He had to retreat to the wilderness and pray and be away from the crowd and rejuvenate in order to minister to people. You can't do ministry 24/7. It's draining. But I will say this. Ministry is rewarding. I'll never forget the first time I helped somebody come to know the Lord. You know, you can live a while on that excitement. I'll not forget the times that I've helped people grow stronger in their faith, led them to a deeper knowledge of Christ, or helped them in some way draw close to him. There's something invigorating about helping other people, especially about helping them spiritually. Now, why am I talking about ministry? Again, I'm not trying to describe to you what I think about my ministry. What I'm telling you is I believe God is calling all of us to ministry. Different kinds, yes. But all of us need to be involved in doing something to reach others. There's no greater blessing than to know you've touched somebody else's life and their lives are different because of you. There's nothing more challenging, more invigorating, more exciting than that. If I say to you, every member ought to be a minister, you might say, well, you know, Pastor, some people just aren't cut out for that. And I tell you, everybody's cut out to do something to help others and reach others. I mean, like that woman we saw in the video, struggling for 1.5 years, she says she prayed and she asked God what ministry she should have. And she was having a hard time, but God said, just stop praying. You've prayed enough. You've thought about it enough. Go do something. And she did. She went to a bar and asked if she could cook a meal for the women in the bar, in the strip joint. And through that, God opened up doors of opportunity for ministry. Now, if she can do that, what can you do? Huh? What can you do? God didn't put you on this earth to sit and enjoy and bask in His blessings. He put you on this earth to minister, to reach out, to help someone else in need. And let me tell you, there are desperate people out there, and if you're willing to minister, you say, I don't know where to find these people. I tell you, if you're open to ministry, God will bring desperate people to you. And desperate people are serious because they're desperate. You don't have to wonder, do these people really want help? They're desperate. You don't have to think, will they receive my help? They're desperate. And there are a lot of desperate people needing help. Question is, how do we help them? And we need to find the answer because God's counting on us. He's counting on us. To continue the ministry of Jesus, He's counting on us. Let's pray.